Welcome back. The head of the Canadian province of Ontario is, listen to this, threatening to cut off electricity exports to the United States. Premier Doug Ford says he will turn off the power supply.
The decision by Canada to halt its electricity exports to the United States in reaction to the announcement of tariffs by the newly elected U.S. president marked a turning point that reverberated across the interconnected energy and trade sectors of North America. This bold move by Canada, framed as a response to a shift in U.S. trade policy under a new administration, underscored the profound interdependency between the two nations. At its core, the decision was not merely about the transfer of electrical power, but was laden with symbolic and practical implications that touched on sovereignty, economic security, and the evolving dynamics of international trade. The move resonated deeply in political circles and business communities alike, as it demonstrated that nations interconnected through shared resources and economic interests can, at times, assert their autonomy in the face of external pressures. In a region long celebrated for its seamless integration of energy networks and trade policies, this development signaled that historical ties were not immune to the pressures of political change and protectionist impulses. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. The energy trade between Canada and the United States has long been characterized by a sense of mutual dependence that goes beyond mere commercial exchange. For decades, the steady flow of electricity across the border has been a symbol of cooperation, facilitating a stable supply that has powered industries, households, and critical infrastructure on both sides. The infrastructure that supports these exchanges was built on the bedrock of decades-old agreements and mutual trust, reflecting a shared commitment to maintaining an open and reliable energy market. Over time, these arrangements have grown into a network that many have come to view as essential to North American economic stability. Yet, the announcement of tariffs by the new U.S. president challenged this established order, igniting a debate about the very nature of cross-border trade in a time when protectionist measures were gaining prominence. The halt in electricity exports represented a dramatic recalibration of this long-standing relationship.
We read in Politico that Ontario Premier Doug Ford threatened to shut off his province's electricity exports to the United States and block shipments of Ontario's high-grade nickel, which he said provides 50% of U.S. supplies. This is per the Globe and Mail.
As it brought into question the ability of historical trade practices to adapt to the shifting tides of political ideology. The tariff announcement by the newly elected U.S. president was a clear signal that the United States intended to revisit its trade relationships and reassert its control over what it considered to be imbalanced economic interactions. The tariffs were positioned as a means to protect domestic industries and to recalibrate trade imbalances that many believed had disadvantaged American workers and companies. In articulating a vision of economic nationalism, the president's policies were aimed at transforming traditional alliances and renegotiating the terms of engagement with longtime partners. This shift in policy, however, was not received in isolation by Canada's policymakers and industry leaders. Instead, it prompted a swift and measured reaction as Canadian authorities sought to leverage their own national interests in the face of a policy environment that was increasingly unpredictable. The Canadian government and its allied energy firms recognized that the tariffs signified more than just an economic adjustment. They represented a broader shift towards a more confrontational approach to international trade that could disrupt the delicate equilibrium that had been maintained for so many years. In response to the new trade policy stance taken by the United States, Canada's decision to halt electricity exports was framed as a necessary and proportionate measure to safeguard its own economic interests and energy security. This decision was not made lightly, as it involved careful deliberation over the potential consequences for both nations. The underlying rationale was rooted in the principle that retaliatory measures could serve as an effective signal against unilateral economic interventions that threatened established trade norms. For Canada, the interruption of the electricity export was a strategic move meant to highlight the interdependencies that define the bilateral relationship. By disrupting the usual flow of energy, Canada was not only asserting its rights as a sovereign nation, but was also drawing attention to the vulnerabilities inherent in a system where one nation's policy shifts could lead to significant disruptions in the energy supply chain. The decision was carefully calibrated to ensure that it would serve as a deterrent against further protectionist measures, while also reinforcing the notion that trade relations must be managed through dialogue and mutual respect, rather than through coercive tariffs. The economic implications of this decision were far-reaching, extending into various sectors that had long relied on the free exchange of energy resources. The immediate effect was the creation of uncertainty in energy markets, as investors and industry stakeholders grappled with the prospect of altered trade flows and potential price volatility. The halting of electricity exports raised important questions about energy pricing, grid stability, and the broader impact on industries that depended on a reliable supply of cross-border energy. Businesses that had built their operational strategies around the assumption of uninterrupted access to Canadian electricity were suddenly confronted with the risk of supply disruptions. This injected an element of volatility into a market that had been characterized by its predictability and resilience. Economic analysts noted that while the short-term effects might be mitigated by contingency measures, the long-term implications could lead to structural shifts in the energy market, prompting both nations to re-examine their approaches to energy security and infrastructure investments. Politically, the halt in electricity exports was laden with symbolism. It represented a repudiation of the unilateral imposition of tariffs and a declaration that Canada was willing to assert its own interests, even if that meant taking a stand against one of its closest allies. The decision was emblematic of a broader trend in international relations, where the reassertion of national sovereignty has often led to a reconfiguration of previously stable partnerships. In this instance, the move was not just about the economics of energy trade, it was about sending a message that cross-border relations are not immune to the pressures of domestic political agendas. The reaction from political commentators was immediate and intense, with many noting that the decision underscored the inherent risks of a protectionist trade policy in a globally interconnected economy. It also raised important questions about the future of diplomatic relations between the two nations, as well as the mechanisms that had long been relied upon to manage disputes in a cooperative and mutually beneficial manner. From the perspective of the energy sector, the decision to cease electricity exports was a stark reminder of the complexities inherent in managing an integrated energy system. The electricity grids of Canada and the United States have long been interwoven, with transmission lines crossing international borders to ensure that supply meets demand across a vast and diverse landscape. The interconnectivity of these systems means that decisions made in one jurisdiction can have ripple effects in another, affecting grid stability and overall energy security. Industry experts noted that the sudden disruption of this flow could force both countries to invest heavily in alternative arrangements, such as developing new transmission infrastructure or accelerating the deployment of domestic energy generation facilities. The move was seen as a potential catalyst for a broader reassessment of how energy networks are managed in an era where national interests might come into conflict with the imperatives of regional cooperation. In this context, the decision highlighted the vulnerabilities that exist in systems that rely on cross-border dependencies, urging policymakers to consider more resilient and self-sufficient strategies for meeting energy needs. The halt in electricity exports also carried significant implications for the broader framework of international trade policy. The tariffs announced by the U.S. president were part of a larger strategy aimed at recalibrating trade relationships that many believed had become lopsided. In response, Canada's decision was a demonstration of the countervailing power that smaller economies can wield when they are willing to stand up to larger trading partners. The move served as a potent reminder that trade agreements are built on a foundation of reciprocity and that unilateral actions can trigger a chain reaction of defensive measures. This episode thus became a focal point in discussions about the balance between free trade and protectionism, prompting scholars, policymakers, and industry leaders to re-examine the principles that underpin modern trade relationships. The decision to halt electricity exports was not merely a reactive measure. It was a calculated strategy designed to influence the broader discourse on international economic policy, urging a return to negotiation and dialogue rather than confrontation and unilateralism. In the realm of domestic politics, the decision generated considerable debate over the appropriate balance between economic pragmatism and nationalistic fervor. Leaders and commentators within Canada argued that the move was necessary to protect national interests and to ensure that Canadian resources were not exploited in a way that undermined long-term economic stability. There was a recognition that while energy exports had historically provided substantial economic benefits, they were also a strategic asset that needed to be safeguarded against external pressures. The decision was framed as an exercise in responsible statecraft, where the interests of Canadian citizens and industries took precedence over short-term economic gains. This perspective resonated with a wide segment of the population, which had grown increasingly wary of policies perceived as overly aggressive or opportunistic. The political discourse surrounding the decision thus reflected a broader societal debate about the nature of national sovereignty in a globalized economy, highlighting the tension between the demands of international cooperation and the imperatives of domestic self-interest. The response from industry insiders was marked by a careful recalibration of expectations and strategies. Energy companies, which had long benefited from the seamless exchange of electricity, found themselves forced to reassess their supply chains and operational contingencies. The disruption of established trading channels was a stark reminder that market conditions could shift rapidly in response to political decisions. Engineers and planners within the sector began to explore alternative configurations for grid management and energy distribution, while financial analysts considered the potential impact on investment strategies. This period of uncertainty was characterized by a cautious optimism that, despite the immediate challenges, the energy sector had the resilience to adapt to new circumstances. The decision by Canada was seen as a test of the robustness of North American energy networks, prompting stakeholders to re-examine assumptions about the permanence of historical trade patterns and the need for diversification in energy sourcing and infrastructure development. The international dimensions of this decision were equally profound, as observers around the world took note of the unfolding drama between two of the most significant economies in the Western Hemisphere. The halt in electricity exports was interpreted by many as an early indicator of a broader realignment in global trade practices, where traditional alliances could be upended by shifts in political ideology and economic strategy. Analysts speculated that the move might encourage other countries to adopt similar measures in response to perceived injustices in the global trading system. In this sense, the decision had the potential to set a precedent, demonstrating that even in regions where cooperation had long been the norm, national interests could override established trade conventions when circumstances demanded it. This international perspective added an extra layer of complexity to the debate, as policymakers and economists sought to understand the full ramifications of a decision that could, in the long run, influence the structure of global economic relations. The event also raised important questions about the role of energy policy in shaping national identity and geopolitical strategy. For Canada, energy exports had long been a cornerstone of its economic identity and a symbol of its ability to contribute meaningfully to the shared prosperity of North America. The decision to halt these exports was thus laden with symbolic weight, reflecting a desire to redefine the terms of engagement in a manner that prioritized national autonomy and strategic self-reliance. In this context, the move was as much about sending a political message as it was about managing an economic transaction. It was an assertion that Canada would not be compelled to support policies that threatened its core interests, even if that meant challenging long-standing practices of cross-border cooperation. This reassertion of national control over energy resources was reflective of broader debates about sovereignty and the right of nations to chart their own courses in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. The implications of the decision reached into the realm of legal and regulatory frameworks as well. Trade agreements and cross-border energy arrangements had been crafted over many years, with legal structures designed to ensure stability and mutual benefit. The sudden halt in electricity exports necessitated a careful review of these agreements, as both countries sought to determine the legal ramifications of such unilateral actions. Legal experts noted that the disruption of established protocols could lead to a re-evaluation of the terms under which energy trade was conducted, potentially opening the door to new regulatory regimes that would better reflect the changing political landscape. The interplay between law, policy, and international relations became a central theme, as stakeholders from both sides of the border considered how to protect their interest within a framework that had historically relied on trust and cooperation. The decision thus prompted a broader discussion about the evolution of trade law in an era marked by rapid political change and the reassertion of national sovereignty. The decision also brought to the fore the issue of energy security and the vulnerabilities inherent in over-reliance on cross-border supplies. In recent years, there had been growing concerns about the resilience of energy grids in the face of geopolitical uncertainty and environmental challenges. The halt in electricity exports served as a wake-up call, highlighting the need for both nations to invest in more robust and diversified energy infrastructures. Energy security had become a paramount concern for policymakers, who recognized that disruptions in supply could have cascading effects on industries, households, and critical public services. In light of this, the decision was viewed as a catalyst for a broader reassessment of energy policies, encouraging both Canada and the United States to explore avenues for enhancing domestic production and developing alternative sources of power. The dialogue that emerged around energy security was both technical and strategic, reflecting an acknowledgement that modern energy systems must be designed with resilience and adaptability in mind. Political messaging played an equally important role in framing the narrative surrounding the decision. Canadian leaders were keenly aware that the halt in electricity exports could be interpreted as a direct challenge to U.S. economic policies, and they sought to convey a sense of resolve and national pride. The messaging was carefully calibrated to emphasize that the decision was not an act of retaliation born out of anger, but rather a measured response intended to protect Canadian interests and to signal a commitment to fair and balanced trade relations. This careful communication strategy was aimed at both domestic and international audiences, reinforcing the notion that Canada was a responsible actor on the global stage, one that would not compromise its values in the face of external pressures. The narrative that emerged was one of strength and independence, portraying the decision as an embodiment of the country's determination to stand up for its own economic and strategic priorities. Such a stance resonated deeply with citizens who had grown increasingly skeptical of policies perceived as overly aggressive or unilateral, reinforcing a sense of national solidarity in a time of uncertainty. The broader implications of this decision extend into the realm of future policy formulation, as both Canada and the United States grapple with the lessons embedded in this episode. For Canada, the halt in electricity exports served as a stark reminder of the need to re-examine trade relationships and to build greater resilience into its energy infrastructure. It prompted policymakers to consider how future agreements could be structured to mitigate the risks of abrupt policy shifts on one side of the border. For the United States, the move underscored the potential costs of pursuing a protectionist agenda without fully accounting for the interconnected nature of modern economies. The decision forced a reconsideration of how trade policies might be designed to balance domestic priorities with the imperatives of international cooperation. In this way, the event opened up a dialogue about the future of North American trade, suggesting that any sustainable solution would have to take into account the delicate interplay between economic interests, energy security, and the broader geopolitical context. The complexity of this situation was further amplified by the differing economic structures and regulatory frameworks that underpin the energy sectors in Canada and the United States. While the two nations share many commonalities, their approaches to energy management have evolved in distinct ways, influenced by historical, environmental, and political factors. In Canada, the management of natural resources and energy exports has often been intertwined with a strong commitment to environmental stewardship and sustainable development. In contrast, the United States has frequently pursued policies that emphasize rapid industrial growth and a more aggressive stance on trade negotiations. These differing priorities came to the forefront in the wake of the tariff announcement, as each country sought to protect its own interests while navigating the challenges of a rapidly shifting global economic landscape. The decision to halt electricity exports was thus not only a response to immediate economic pressures, but also a reflection of deeper structural differences in how the two nations viewed their roles in the global economy. The strategic dimensions of the decision also revealed much about the evolving nature of international power dynamics In an era marked by uncertainty and rapid change, the halt in electricity exports signaled that smaller, resource-rich nations were increasingly willing to assert their autonomy and to challenge the economic hegemony of larger trading partners. It reflected a broader trend in which nations were rethinking traditional alliances and exploring new avenues for protecting their interests in a multipolar world. This recalibration of power dynamics was not limited to the realm of energy trade. It had broader ramifications for how countries approached economic negotiations and international diplomacy. The decision underscored the importance of flexibility, strategic foresight, and the willingness to embrace new paradigms in an era where past assumptions could no longer be taken for granted. It was a vivid illustration of the fact that, in today's interconnected world, the lines between domestic policy and international relations are increasingly blurred, and that actions taken on one side of a border can have profound effects on the broader global stage. The interplay between economics and politics in this episode provided a rich tapestry of insights into the challenges faced by nations seeking to navigate a turbulent international environment. The decision to halt electricity exports was emblematic of a broader debate about the appropriate role of government intervention in the economy and the limits of free trade in a world where national interests often collide with the imperatives of global cooperation. It raised questions about the balance between protecting domestic industries and maintaining open channels of communication and exchange with neighboring countries. In this regard, the move served as a case study in the complexities of modern governance, where economic decisions are inextricably linked to political considerations and where the stakes are often much higher than they appear at first glance. The unfolding debate forced observers to confront the reality that in a world marked by rapid change and shifting alliances, no policy can be seen in isolation from the broader geopolitical and economic currents that shape our lives. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Canada halting electricity exports to the US? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.